Hello. Again, hello.
Hello.
You know, so often we say this is a person who needs no introduction, although you got some very nice ones, which you deserve. Okay. But you know, today it's actually true, because each of you is a person who for years or for months has become so much a part of, well, it's true, right? I speak the truth.
Always appreciate accuracy.
Right? So much a part of the cultural conversations that I think a lot of people think they know you, even if they don't. As well, and unfortunately, there are also people on whom people project things. You are all people on whom people project their anxieties, their fears, their resentments. So I think it's a really great opportunity for us to actually hear from you and to actually know as much about you as you are willing to share about what has kind of brought you and propelled each of you on your various journeys. So thank you for being here. And I'm going to start with you because you're kind of our senior diva, kind of. and I want to know, you know, Marsha pointed out that Johnny Caucus was created the same year that the center was created, and women have been such a part of. Is that true? Speaking about accuracy in media here?
Yeah, she was created in 1972 as well, and her name was to honor the National Women's Political Caucus, which was another sister organization that was many members here, which reached out to me when I first started writing about feminist issues and drew me into their little motley band of organizers. And I ended up doing a number of benefits for them. And in the early years, it was, they were astonishingly welcome of a man. I think I was the first male member of the National Women's Political Caucus. And I would go to meetings where there were hundreds of women and just me. And my friends assumed
But you had no line for the men's room, which was excellent.
Right, right.
I'm sure that worked out really well.
And my friends assumed that this was that I'd stumbled onto a kind of awesome dating strategy. But it really, I was just mesmerized. I mean, something transformative was happening, and I was just so thrilled that I was allowed to be in the room.
I was going to ask you, though, is it something you stumbled upon, or is it something that you chose? You know, often people think that when you choose to cover something, it's because you're, you know, down with the cause. But sometimes it's just because it's a great story, and in which case, what was it for you?
Well, it began with my senior year in college. I was interviewed by two sociologists who went on to some fame, two women who were doing their masters on the women arriving at Yale. This was their first year, and so they were interviewing men to get a kind of a baseline of what Yale views were like. And I was a prime candidate because I was doing this very popular sexist comic strip on campus that seemed to represent what old Yale was like. I went in totally clueless, did not feel either before or after that it was an ambush, and spent an afternoon answering these questions about my views of women. And I came out in kind of a daze, feeling that you know, a real sense of unease, that my answers did not actually speak to my own feelings about the relationship of men and women. And I think from then on, I was just asking a lot of questions. I said, something is really changing here, something important. And I hated my answers. And I thought, there's got to be a better way of embracing this issue and thinking about it. And so that just put me on that path.
You know, speaking of a better way of thinking and embracing issues, Anita Hill, you've been at the forefront of some truly painful at times, but always powerful and important conversations. But one of the markers of when you have an impact is when you show up in a Gary Trudeau strip, in a Doonesbury strip. So I want to know, when you showed up in that strip, what was that like for you? Was it surreal? Was it thinking, oh God, I'm really cooked?
Well, then you know life is not going to be the same again. But you talk about people projecting their fears upon you. And I think one of the things that I feel very fortunate about is that people also project their hopes and their aspirations on me. And that really does balance it out. Because, you know, you can deal with the tensions that are created, if there are really tensions. if it's not just entirely one-sided, where people are just sort of dumping on you all the time. Not that that has happened to you. And by the way, I was on a panel recently, and it was someone mentioned that, the use of the term slut, and I said, well, yes, I've been there. So yes, I have been there. Yeah. No one ever wants to be in that position. But at the same time, what makes it not all right, but what helps you to understand it is that on the other side, the flip side of those fears are people who have real needs to hear from you and to see you, and for you to be visible, whether it's in a comic strip or for you to be visible as a public figure out there yourself, being engaged in these conversations. And so you do it because, one, it's the right thing to do, and because this is a moment where we all need to be engaged. And if you can use a situation to put yourself in a place where you can help make change, then that's what you do. And you embrace a life that is not what you thought you were going to have, but one that can be truly meaningful.
Did you like the strips that he did about you?
I did. I mean, I like all of his strips. No, it's flattery to be in the company of, just to be thought of by someone who does such great work and such meaningful work, and work that you yourself have read over the years, and that has actually helped you understand what's at stake in the issue. So, of course, you want to save those. You want to be there. I mean,
leave them lying strategically on the counter.
Yeah, well, who would say, okay, well, I just don't want to be in one of your issues. Well, unless you're on the wrong side of the issues, and I'm never on the wrong side.
Sandra, do you remember when you first heard the name Anita Hill, and do you remember in what context?
She's 11.
I was about.
Don't give your age when you heard it.
I'll say that I was significantly younger at the time. I don't remember the exact first moment, but I do remember my impression of what was happening, of that situation, and I haven't told you this before, so I hope it's all right if I share it with everyone.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was really young, and I was in a very conservative environment, and my impression of what it was that had happened was that Clarence Thomas had this sexual harassment scandal with his secretary, and that was so completely inaccurate of a perception, but I think unfortunately reflects what may be the stereotype, the assumption of many young people at times, and that's
you
what
thought
my
it was
impression.
the secretary. Okay.
I did, and I don't know if that was because this was a young woman or a young black woman, or I don't know where I got that perception from, but that was what my perception was as a child.
And when did you realize what the story really was, and do you remember whether it had any impression on you? Because I know there are a lot of us here who can remember exactly where we were and what we were doing. I know I can when I heard what I heard, I mean, not knowing much more beyond that. But I mean, it's one of those things that really, it's like seared into my memory. But for you, when you figured out what it really was about, do you remember what you thought?
I mostly thought about how wrong I had been. And I thought about why had I had that impression when that was so completely inaccurate, and what an accomplished woman you were. And that was what was sort of the forceful moment for me, because by that time, so much had been accomplished because of those important conversations and that important media spotlight that sexual harassment was in a different vein and was understood in a different way.
Michel made the point that each of you was very young, is very young, when the spotlight came to you, and you can't possibly know what it's all going to mean. But I am curious to know, just if I could just ask each of you, when you had that moment of realization that you did have the spotlight and it could be a choice of what could happen, I am interested in how that revelation came to you and what you thought it would be about, what you thought that spotlight would be about. Sandra, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I was struck actually by how exactly familiar your words when you were speaking just now about that choice were, that is so much of what has gone through my mind in making the decisions to continue to engage with the public conversation, to try to affect positive change. When initially all of this happened, I certainly thought, well, I won't have as much time to study this week, but I'll get through it, and then life will go on. So I certainly did not in any way expect the twists and turns that 2012 has been.
How did you first hear about the whole, we don't need to say his name, do we?
Especially since there were so many names
Exactly.
that could be said.
We don't need to say. When you first heard what had been said, do you remember what went through your mind? Because I can imagine you drawing a thought bubble.
Well,
That would
yeah,
have
I
been
mean, suitable for the comics.
suitable for the comics, right?
When I first heard that, it was an answer to a question because I'd been getting personal contacts that were quite problematic for a brief period before that, and I wasn't sure where that was coming from and why that was happening. And so I figured out, this is what's causing these contacts, because there are consequences when someone goes on the air and espouses an idea. Their listeners and their viewers take action upon that idea. So that was one thing that came to mind, and the second thing that came to mind was that I needed to call my parents. It was important to me that I reach them and that I tell them what was happening so that they heard about it from me rather than from someone else or heard the clips directly.
Does it hurt?
There are aspects of it that have been difficult and painful, but that particular portion I was able to deal with, and I wonder about your experience, if there's any similarity, by realizing that so much of it was not really about me, but it was about a young woman and the action she was taking, and that speaking up for reproductive health care was viewed in a certain way. And so I was able to realize that it wasn't necessarily about me personally. And in that way, it's actually sometimes more difficult to deal with some of the other projections, as you were describing them, more recently, because those projections have more to do with my ideas and the content of what I've said. They may be completely inaccurate, but they have more to do with something that's actually about me, as opposed to a caricature of me or a hateful stereotype that's been around for a long time.
You didn't have the slow build. This was the pre-internet age. So you woke up one morning and there were news crews on your lawn, and
to actually date this whole episode is out of the internet era. I remember being told that Western Union had crashed during the time. Now, there were telegrams. There
Media
were these
matters.
things called telegrams that existed. So that there were telegrams. And now, who's sent a telegram lately? But Western Union had crashed. So, no, there weren't emails. There weren't, but nevertheless, whatever media was available or medium was available, people were using to get the word out. So, and it is interesting because, at this point in my life, I have probably about 20,000 letters. And that wouldn't happen today. And I think that, and so in some ways, I benefit from it because I have that record that wouldn't exist today except electronically. And I have telegrams, and they're artifacts. But in fact, it's significant, and nevertheless, the whole idea was communicated. And yes, I did wake up, and there was press on my lawn, and the surprising thing was, because I had not really dealt with the press, that they felt really entitled to be on my lawn and to be a presence in my life. But I don't think you can imagine that, can you? But
was I there?
We'll talk about that later.
Might have been.
There's nothing that could prepare you. There is absolutely nothing that can prepare you. And yes, it is. You can deal with it by saying, well, it's really not about me. But on the other hand, I think that people need to realize that there are people involved when we have someone step out, that these are not just sort of characters that get picked up and put out and then they go back home and their lives are the same. And these are real people, and we do have real feelings, and it may not happen on the same scale when someone sticks their neck out, or they file a complaint, or they speak up against something that's wrong. You may not have press on your lawn, but in our day-to-day experiences, when this happens to people, we need to understand that those people are at risk. Maybe from a smaller thing, but speaking out carries a risk. And I think so on the one hand, you can get around it by saying, well, it's not about me, it's about the issue, it's about people's fears, but there are real people involved for all of these things that happen, where people take risk and they speak out and they speak up for things that are right. And so
I was going to ask each of you about this, and Gary, I'm going to start again with you on this, is that, each of you has been threatened at times. And I don't know, for you, there are times when your strip has been canceled, or people have threatened to sort of cancel your. I don't know if you have been personally threatened, because I've never heard you talk about it. It wouldn't shock me if you had been.
No, I've been attacked for pretty much from the very beginning. It's been a routine part of my life, and I do think it's part of the job description to some degree. I mean, I think what the two of you have been through, just there's no way you can't take that personally. And I think perhaps because my face isn't out there, I'm off stage usually. I don't take it as personally, and I just consider it's part it comes with the territory. The only time I didn't actually feel a risk, my wife thought I was at risk, was when I was writing about Frank Sinatra. And he sent a lawyer our way. They
lawyer.
said
okay, a lawyer. Oh, a lawyer. Oh, okay.
Not one of those.
Wow. See, I was going somewhere else, but okay.
So I think that
I'm from New York, so
that was how they started.
Okay.
And the lawyer sent my employers a letter saying that I had misrepresented the facts of such and such an incident where Mr. Sinatra was involved. And my editor called me up and said, well, did you misrepresent the facts? And I said, well, of course I did. I made them up. It would not have been a long trial. And I mean, it's a comic strip. So he while his publicist kind of went after me week after week after week, he didn't say anything. And when I knew I was finally safe, because Kitty Kelly was calling me up, she'd written this great biography about Sinatra, and she was calling me up with all these horror stories, things that he had been alleged to have done or had people do for him. And so I was a little nervous until there was a concert he gave in Carnegie Hall in August of that year. And he went out on stage, and it was his hometown, well, close to hometown, Hoboken, and it was his audience. And he said, he started going after me, and everyone was cheering him on, and he's as funny as a tumor, and on and on. And then finally made a huge mistake. He said, and he married his wife and made her an honest woman and got her job. And this audience, this neighborhood audience, said, you just broke the first rule of the neighborhood. You don't attack the women and children. And they booed him. It's probably the only time, Frank Sinatra's been booed by his hardcore fans. Then I knew I was safe, because he'd gone public, he'd spoken publicly, and so I figured after that, what you fear, of course, is they don't go public, and then
that's true.
Bad things can happen, as did to many of his adversaries.
Are there critics? Well, can I talk to you about Professor Hill? There was I was working in New York. I was actually getting my hair cut, which didn't take that long back then. And I actually was listening, the people at the salon had, or the barbershop, I don't remember what it was, had on a radio show where somebody actually called you up first thing in the morning to try to put you on the radio to embarrass you.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, this cannot be happening. And in fact, somebody called you up, like first thing in the morning, it must have been before, and you were so gracious. You were so unperturbed, seemingly. And you, of course, hung up the phone. You didn't cuss, you didn't do anything. And, but I was afraid for you.
Yeah.
And I would have to ask you, forgive me, are you ever afraid?
And not so much lately. I'm
Were
not
you
trying
then?
to invite anything.
Were you afraid?
Oh yes, I was. Yes, I mean there
What were you
were
afraid of?
threats, and I mean I guess I was afraid of bodily harm. I remember once my mother and my sister were there visiting, and my sister was there with her kids, and there was a bomb threat that the university got, saying that someone was going to bomb my home, and so I was more afraid for them. And so I guess my real fear was that, the first fear, of course, is that your family's going to be hurt, because I come from a very close family. And so that was, but I think there were all kinds of threats to me. And it wasn't just a threat, physical harm, it was a threat to my ability to make a living because people wanted to remove my tenure. There was a threat to, friendships, because there were people who tried to drive wedges between me and my colleagues. I mean, there were all kinds of threats. At some point I don't know, you just sort of get numb to some of it.
Well, I wanted to ask you, what kept you going? What kept the incident I'm describing was years after the hearings.
Yeah.
Years after the hearings. And so I can only imagine.
Well, there
how
are
long.
things that do happen years after.
Yeah. Well, yes,
you do get phone calls.
Well, there's that. You do get phone calls. I hear there are phone calls that are actually made.
So yes, you wrote a script about that. One of those phone calls. They happen.
What kept you going? What has kept you going all this time?
I think there are a number of things that have kept me going. One, I talk about my family, and I have a wonderful family, and I have a lot of faith. I really do have faith in the righteousness, if you will, of my position. I think it's right to speak out on behalf of women and tell the truth about your experiences, and that should be honored. And that's in so many ways why your experience resonated with me. It's just being able to do that ought to be a part of what is American. And in our system of democracy, we all ought to be able to have our voice. And so that, I think, keeps me going on that level. But, it takes a lot of friendships, it takes a lot of support, it takes a great family, it takes a lot of faith in God, it takes a lot of people sort of forgiving you when you're not really at your best. It takes it takes a lot of personal soul searching on an individual's part. But back to that whole personalizing things, I think there's lessons to be learned in personalizing it, because had people not seen me as a person, I don't think it would have precipitated the kinds of conversations that then began to take place. Mm-hmm. So that I did not want to sort of become this robot or public figure that didn't have any emotions or fears. I didn't want to let everybody know exactly what all of the fears were, but I wanted people to know that this was real. And I was just reading Jeffrey Tubin's book when we were talking about, he was talking about the Ledbetter decision, and he talked about Justice Ginsburg reading that dissent. And in reading her dissent in the Goodyear case that ruled against Lilly Ledbetter, what she did was so brilliant. It was to personalize Lilly Ledbetter from the bench. And had it not been read and characterized in that way, we might not have the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act today. So I think that is really part of what allows us to get to change. Somebody has to take a risk, and it has to be personal. And in that way, it's when it resonates with people and then moves others as well.
But, go ahead.
Well, also, I was just going to say, we respond to stories, and that's how we identify with things. And I really think that once you started telling a story to that committee, you didn't just characterize a relationship or characterize what your estimation of Clarence Thomas. You told a story. And that narrative sucked everybody in. And I do think it advanced the conversation, the public conversation about sexual harassment in the workplace 5 years. I mean, it just suddenly became something that everybody had to kind of deal with and think about. And that's a powerful story. People won't forget it. And in that sense, it will always remain personal. It'll always be, Anita Hill's story.
It's interesting, though, that initially the polls, and you know this better than anybody, the polls show that most people didn't believe you. A year later, they did. A year later, a majority of people did believe you. So it took kind of a year for
the process
to sink in. So that's why I'm curious to ask you, are you surprised, speaking of personal, making stuff personal, are you surprised that Sandra Fluke is sitting here for the reason she's sitting here? That somebody, all these years later somebody would be calling a young woman names for wanting to testify at a congressional hearing. Are you surprised by that?
I am. I honestly, and I'm not, that easily shocked. But I think our situation was just shocking to us in 2012 to be thinking, or it was 2012 or 2011? 2012. To be thinking that this could happen in the scenario that contributed to this whole the conversation around contraception, that women could be excluded from that table. To talk about this issue and what it meant to them in their lives. And so, yes, I was shocked, and then the aftermath of it was shocking. But I think it's because we want to think that we've come so far. And then we're back, sort of snapped back into reality when a situation like yours occurs. And so I think if we looked at it and asked most of the people, most of us would be shocked. I don't think I was the only one who was surprised, but it just brings us back to the reality of where many people still are and not willing to accept change.
Even so few months after there was such an amazing outcry from the public about how wrong that was, the young woman who merely asked a question at the town hall debate, at the second presidential debate. She didn't talk about her personal life. She didn't state a position. All she did was ask a question of the presidential nominees what they would do about fair pay, and she was personally attacked in the press, and there was, going into her personal Facebook and all of that. It just so soon thereafter, and that was disappointing to me that so quickly we were right back there.
Why don't we spend the time that we have left? We've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I would love to hear from each of you about what would make a difference. I know that's a tall order, but what would make a difference? And Marcia and Duffy were kind of giving you homework, so giving all of you homework. So. Feel free to give some homework if you would like. If you want to give people a charge, if you want to tell people things that you think that they could do, should do, would you like them to do, feel free to do that too. What do you think would make a difference? You're looking at me all like, I'm not in that business. I'm not in the should business.
That's way out of my lane, yeah.
No, it isn't.
I just try to ask questions as you do. I just try to hold the mirror up a little differently. No, I have no prescriptions for moving forward.
Do you feel hopeful or not hopeful?
I do, but that's
different.
That's different in this that I don't think you can do what I do if you're not hopeful. If you don't believe kind of in this against all odds and against all evidence that in the perfectibility of humankind. I mean, I feel that there's a better version of us. I always feel that way. And I don't think how you can practice satire if you don't. Otherwise, you're just, a cynic.
Okay. How about that? Professor Hill?
Well, you know, I'm a lawyer and I teach law, and so one of the points that was made early tonight about the vacancies in the courts, in the federal courts, I think getting those filled at this point in the next 4 years can make a profound difference. And you know, whatever people can do, whether it's picking up the phone and calling whoever represents them in the Senate and saying this has to be a priority for this term to get those people through the process in 4 years. And I've talked about this in speeches, so I know the numbers. I think I'm up to date on it. 4 years ago, when President Obama first took the office, there were 66 vacancies in the federal system. Now there are 78. And so it's really important, because I don't think any of us believe that we can move us forward without the right judges, with the right background and the right perspectives in the positions, not just on the Supreme Court, but in the district courts and the courts of appeal.
I would certainly agree. I will forego the very long list of things I think you should call your representatives about. But I agree with that one. I would actually like to come back to a point that you were making earlier about how important it is to put a face on a policy, on a change that needs to happen, on something that should be fought for. That's important not only for those who have the opportunity to be that face in a very public way, but for all of us in our daily lives. To talk about the ways that policies impact us and the things we're struggling with in our lives, and to share even things that are very personal and difficult to talk about, like having been a victim of sexual assault or a victim of sexual harassment, or reproductive health care needs, or things that are even less personal. You know, my parents are here tonight, and yet I'm talking a lot about them. So it's,
well, hi, parents. Where are you?
But
Where are they? Are they here?
They are here.
Where are they? Let's holler at them. Where are they? Hi, parents. Thank you.
But
Thank you for supporting this amazing young woman when it would have been really easy to be really mad.
But the reason I point to them is that I know that my mother this year was listening to President Clinton's speech at the Democratic National Convention and heard him talking about Social Security policy, and turned to my fiance and said, "But that's me." Thinking about the age requirements and who it would impact. And I think we all have to have those "but that's me" moments, but that's my friend, my relative, my neighbor, and we have to talk to the people in our lives about that, so that everyone around us has the face to put on the things we're debating in the political arena, because these aren't abstract numbers, as we were talking about earlier. These are people's lives that we're debating.
You know, each of you, as we opened our conversation, talked about the fact that you each have your own story, but you are also a person upon whom people project stories and want to break their legs or other body parts, apparently, so at some point. So before we let you go, would each of you mind just leaving us with a story or something that you would wish we would take away from this evening and this time together? It can be anything. You could be talking to the younger you could be talking to the
older me.
The older you. You could be talking to the person who thought Anita Hill was a secretary.
Yes.
And say, what's the story would you leave us with something to take away and think about?
Well, I mean, this has brought back a lot of memories for me in the years that I was spending a lot of time in Washington, kind of working on some of these issues. And what set me down that path was a phone call I got when I was a young man, and so now I'm channeling that young man for you. And I had a year between college and graduate school, and I just started the script. And it was a call from my cousin, and I was living in Colorado at the time. And that she sounded quite distraught. And she said, "Could you come visit me? I'm in Aspen." And I said, "Well, how the hell did you get to Aspen? You live in White Plains with your 3 children and your husband." And she said, "Not anymore, I don't." And so I got in my Jeep and I drove over to Aspen. And what had happened is that she was on a trip with her husband and her kids. And they got to somewhere in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, and they got into a horrendous fight that was the culmination of some serious problems in this marriage. And she said, "Let me out." So she stepped out of that car, and her husband just kept driving with the 3 boys. And she hitchhiked into Aspen. And so when I heard the story, I went over to see her immediately. And she had this unfurnished room. And I, for 3 days, I just camped out on the floor of her apartment and listened to her tell me, in effect, the diary of the Mad Housewife, what she had been through, what her life had been like. And at the time, as someone who had survived divorce in my own family, you would think that all I would be thinking about were my counterparts, my cousins, and these 3 boys who had been, in effect, abandoned. But instead, I was just drawn into this story, and it fit into that larger narrative of women who were just turning their lives upside down. All my friends who got married in the early 70s ended up being divorced because they married women who were just in swirling motion. It was such a transformative time. The person they married a year later was someone else. And it was a privilege to have kind of a ringside seat to that. But at the same time, it made me understand that if I was going to be any good at what I was planned to do with my life, that if I just listened, and this speaks to what you were saying, is find those faces, listen to their stories, and that's what I ended up doing. Is I try to individuate these problems by even for the strips that I did last spring about transvaginal sonograms. I tried to create characters, both the young women and the caregivers, from a standing start. I tried to create characters that people could say, "Oh, yeah, that could be my daughter." And so I think we're probably saying the same thing, but I said it somewhat differently.
Thank you. Professor Hill,
my story.
you too.
Well, I want to try to tell this as quickly as possible, but one of the things that now that I'm not as young as I was when I testified, I think about the sort of arc of my life, and I think about a woman who was a great influence to me, a woman named Ada Lois Scipio Fisher, who at about 19 years old, Elaine Jones knows the story of, at 19 years old, she sued the University of Oklahoma College of Law. She actually sued the Board of Regents at Oklahoma University for admissions into law school. She was an African American. She allowed herself to be a plaintiff. She was represented by Thurgood Marshall. She sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, won, eventually won, and there was hostility. She did graduate from the university law school, but this was, in an era in the 1940s when there was a movement to break segregation, and starting with the professional schools. And so she won her lawsuit, but I didn't really know much about her until later in her life, in the 1980s, when I was actually teaching at the University of Oklahoma. And so I met her. She, at that point, I was a young professor, and the first thing that she said to me after the hearings was, "Anita, you are my kind of woman." And I was so thrilled to hear that coming from this icon of the civil rights movement, one of the few plaintiffs in those early civil rights cases that were women going to professional schools. So, there weren't that many women in law schools at the time, much less African American women. And and at the time that I met her in 1991, she was on the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. So I keep in mind that, it's this how they say the arc of a moral universe. It's long, bends towards justice, bends toward equality, and that if we just keep living long enough and we keep fighting, and one of these days I will be the symbol that Ada Lois Sipple Fisher was.
Professor Anita Hill, thank you. Sandra?
So I will share a story that I think is kind of amusing and probably also revealing about my personality, unfortunately. Earlier this year, I had the opportunity to meet the president in person, and I had never met him before. And he said to me, I want to thank you for the work that you've been doing. I'm very proud of what you've been fighting for. And I, of course, said, well, I'm proud of you, too. Which, afterwards, I immediately thought, oh, my God. The president thinks I'm uppity now. And so that's what it, sort of reveals about my personality. And so the next time I had the occasion to speak with him personally was that he called me after the DNC speech and to thank me for doing that and to say that I had done a nice job on my speech. And I, of course, said, well, you did a nice job, too. So either I was taught very well to be polite and always return the compliment, or I'm incapable of viewing even the president as someone who is above me and I should be respectful to. But also, very characteristically of my personality, I've now convinced myself that I was doing the right thing because what I was doing was treating my president, my elected official, as equal to me and someone who needed to answer to me about whether or not I was proud of what he was doing. So I'm not uppity, I'm democratic. And so that's what I intend to keep doing for the foreseeable future, and that I think we all have to keep doing, because we, many of the people in this room worked very hard in this recent election to elect folks who we believe will be champions for the things that we want and that we have fought for, and now is the time to make sure that they live up to the trust we put in them.
Sandra Fluke, thank you for joining us. Sandra Fluke, Anita Hill, Gary Trudeau, thank you. Thank you all.